Malachi Thorne had lived alone for 10 years, and not by accident. 10 winters, 10 scorching summers, 10 harvests of silence and stubborn self-preservation. His ranch sat high in the Nevada mountains, where wind carved the valley like an old god's knife, and time moved slower than regret. The world he'd known filled with promises, law and betrayal had become a distant echo. Once he had worn a badge, stood for justice, and believed in the good that men could do. But all of that burned down the day he found his wife tangled in the arms of another man, the kind of man who shook hands with judges and wiped his boots on the truth. Malachi didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just left, sold the house in Copper Creek, packed his horse, and rode until no one could find him. The mountains welcomed him like a fellow exile. He built the cabin with his own hands, every nail a prayer for peace, every timber a wall against memory. People stopped writing. He stopped answering. No one came. He preferred it that way. Solitude wasn't punishment, it was protection. From lies, from weakness, from the sharp, bright ache of caring. He didn't drink much, didn't sleep deeply, and rarely spoke aloud. Some days he wasn't even sure what his voice sounded like anymore. He mended fences, chopped wood, fed his horses, and made peace with the ghosts that sometimes passed through his porch light. That was his life, and he'd learned not to ask for more. Until the storm came. Until she came. The night she arrived, the sky broke open like a split seam, spilling thunder and vengeance across the valley. Rain came down in waves, soaking the earth and turning Malachi's porch into a slick, groaning slab of wet pine. He'd been inside by the fire, cradling a chipped coffee mug and pretending not to listen to the wind wail like a wounded coyote. But then he heard something else, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Not quite a cry, not quite a word, more like a sob torn in half by the wind. Malachi set his mug down, stood slowly, and opened the door. For a moment the rain blurred everything, a curtain of silver slicing through the blackness. Then he saw her. Crumpled at the foot of his steps, half submerged in mud, was a woman in a wedding dress, white silk turned gray by dirt, and rain clinging to her skin like a shroud. Lace trailed behind her like the wreckage of a dream that hadn't made it to the altar. Her head was bowed, her arms slack, and for one awful second, Malachi thought she was dead. Just another broken soul the world had dumped at his doorstep to test whether he still had any humanity left. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, heart thudding with something he didn't want to name. No one had set foot on his land in a decade, and now this, a bride, as if the universe had saved its cruelest joke for a stormy Tuesday in June. But jokes or not, she was real, and she was hurt. That much he could see. He took a step toward her, then another, the rain soaking through his jeans like icy fingers. When he knelt beside her, she didn't flinch. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale. Up close, he could see dark bruises blooming beneath the lace on her wrist, finger-shaped, fresh, and unmistakable. Someone had grabbed her. Someone had tried to own her. Malachi had seen those marks before, back when he still believed it was his job to stop them. He could have walked away, could have stepped back into his warm, dry cabin, closed the door, and pretended he hadn't seen anything. Let the storm take her. Let time and fate do what they would. After all, he didn't know her. She was a stranger, another complication in a world he'd worked hard to make simple. But as lightning flared again and lit her face in a quicksilver flash, something inside him cracked. She looked so young, so lost. Her hair was plastered to her skin, but her features were delicate, soft cheekbones, trembling lashes, lips, slightly parted like she'd tried to speak before the pain swallowed her. Malachi remembered that face, not her face specifically, but that look. He'd seen it in the mirror 10 years ago on the day everything in his life burned down. That raw, shell-shocked disbelief that the world had turned cruel while you weren't looking. Without a word, he reached under her knees and back and lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, her soaked dress no match for the strength he'd built, hauling feed and lumber for a decade. Her head rolled gently onto his shoulder as he carried her inside, careful not to jostle her. He laid her on the old leather couch he'd once slept on night after night to avoid the empty bed in the back room. Her dress squelched against the cushions, water dripping from both of them onto the pine floor. He stoked the fire higher, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and knelt by her side. For just a moment her eyes fluttered open, green-wide, flickering with confusion and the flicker of something deeper. Relief. Malachi's heart thudded. He hadn't let himself feel that in years. And then her eyes closed again. But in that tiny moment, something shifted in him. A forgotten warmth pressed against his ribs. Hope. Damn it all. Hope. Whatever storm brought her here wasn't done yet. But neither, it seemed, was he. Evangeline woke to warmth, which was wrong. The last thing she remembered was freezing rain carving its way into her skin, her body failing beneath the weight of panic and silk. But now there was firelight flickering on wooden beams and the earthy smell of cedar smoke in the air. She jerked upright, heart pounding, her hand flying instinctively to her chest, and froze. Her wedding dress was gone. In its place, a coarse wool blanket was wrapped tightly around her like armor. Panic shot through her like a bullet. Her gaze darted across the room. The man, tall, weathered, and silent, sat in a wooden chair by the window, not moving, not speaking, just watching her with eyes the color of mountain steel. He didn't approach, didn't make a sound. There was a stillness to him, not the kind that comes from calm, but the kind that comes from years of retreat. She clutched the blanket tighter, her voice barely audible through her raw throat. "Where am I?" the words scraped out like sandpaper. "My ranch," he replied, voice gravel, thick with disuse. "Middle of nowhere, which I reckon is exactly where you were aiming." Evangeline blinked, her mind still fogged. The fire popped behind her, casting heat against her spine. She noticed her wedding gown hanging from a clothesline by the hearth, steaming faintly like a ghost wrung out and hung to dry. "You changed my clothes." Her voice was sharper now, defensive. The man didn't flinch. "You were soaked to the bone, freezing. I didn't have a choice." His tone wasn't apologetic, it was matter of fact, practical, not a hint of desire or mockery. That unsettled her more than lust would have. He wasn't looking at her like a man looks at a woman. He was looking at her like a man who's been alone too long and is afraid to care again. Evangeline stared at him across the room, trying to make sense of her surroundings and of him. The stone fireplace, the creaky floorboards, the kettle humming softly on a rusted iron stove. Everything about the place whispered of solitude, of years spent nursing wounds too old to show. She shifted on the couch muscles, aching throat dry as ash. "Thank you," she said, finally, her voice uncertain, edged with wariness. He gave a small nod, but no smile. Silence stretched between them like a tightrope. "What do you want from me?" she asked bluntly. The words came out sharper than she intended, but they were reflex defense mechanisms, honed by years of surviving men who always expected something in return. His brow twitched, just a flicker, but it was enough. Malachi looked away, eyes going to the window, as if searching for something outside that made more sense than the question she'd just asked. Nothing, he said. One word heavy as an oath. Evangeline didn't believe him. Couldn't. Not after everything she'd been through. Men didn't help without wanting something back. Safety always came with a price, even when it looked like kindness. Especially then. But this man, he didn't look like the others. He looked tired. Not weak, but worn down, like a structure built too strong to collapse, but hollowed out on the inside. Still, she couldn't trust him. "Not yet. I'll leave as soon as the storm lets up," she said, voice thin but steady. His eyes flicked back to hers, unreadable. "You can't outrun what's behind you," he said, and though he didn't ask her to explain, she felt like he already knew. Not the details, but the shape of the fear, and worse, the weight of being hunted. The words left her before she could catch them. "I can't go back." They hung in the air like smoke curling into the corners of the room. Malachi didn't respond. He didn't press, didn't prod, just waited. That silence, that stillness, it broke something in her. "I was supposed to be married today," she said, her throat tightening. "To a man I didn't choose, to pay off my brother's debt." Her fingers traced the edges of the blanket, gripping it like it might anchor her. He owed money to someone powerful, someone dangerous. She looked up then, straight into Malachi's eyes. "His name is Clayton Voss." That name hit the room like thunder. Malachi didn't move, but she saw it in the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled slightly on the armrest. He knew that name. And not in passing. Evangeline kept going. "My brother thought he was saving me. But Clayton doesn't buy brides. He buys ownership. He put bruises on my arms before we even made it to the altar. I ran before the vows, through the back door of the church and into the storm. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "He'll come for me. He doesn't lose. He doesn't forgive. And now," she looked around the cabin, "now I've dragged a stranger into his path." Malachi's voice came low, graveled. "You didn't drag anyone. He was already there." Evangeline blinked, confused, but he didn't explain. Just stood, slowly moved toward the fire and adjusted the logs. His silence was thick, but not judgmental. She watched him, waiting for anger, for fear, but what she saw instead was worse. Recognition. Clayton Voss wasn't just part of her nightmare. He'd walked through Malachi's before, and left scars behind. The name Clayton Voss didn't echo, it detonated. Malachi didn't say anything at first, didn't need to. Evangeline saw it in his posture, in the way he stared into the fire, as though it had just whispered secrets he'd buried long ago. Clayton wasn't a stranger to him. He was a ghost, one Malachi had spent a decade trying to outrun, and failing. "You know him," she said, not a question, but a realization. Malachi's hands tightened around the iron poker he was holding, knuckles going white, but his voice stayed low. "I knew a girl once," he said slowly, "who thought she could beat him." The way he said girl made Evangeline's stomach drop. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 19. Bright-eyed, too good for this world. He turned to look at her shadows flickering across his face. "She came to me once, said Voss was forcing her into marriage. Her father owed him everything, just like your brother. I was sheriff then. Believed in the law. Believed I could protect her." Evangeline didn't interrupt, didn't breathe. She already knew how the story ended. "A week later they found her in the river," he said flatly. "Bruises on her neck. Mud in her lungs. Sheriff's report said suicide." His jaw clenched, pain flashing beneath the surface like heat lightning. "But I saw the marks. I knew better. I filed a report, collected witness statements, had the beginnings of a case, and then everything disappeared. Every file, every testimony, gone, and Sheriff Bradley. 2 days later, he moved into a new house and told me to let it go." Evangeline felt cold all over. She had known Clayton Voss was cruel. But this was something else. This was rot running deep beneath the surface of a territory that smiled while it bled. "So you left," she whispered. Malachi nodded once. "I left the badge, left the town, left everything, because I couldn't save her." He looked at her then, not with pity, but with something sharper, a fierce, painful clarity. "But maybe I can save you." Evangeline didn't respond. Not right away. The weight of his story settled over her like wet wool, heavy, suffocating, but honest. Malachi had once been the kind of man who believed in fighting back, and he'd been broken for it. Now here she was, another girl with bruises and no choices fallen into his orbit, like some cruel second chance. "You don't have to get involved," she said quietly. "If you turn me out, I won't blame you. He's dangerous. You know that?" Malachi didn't look away. "I also know what happens when no one stands up." She shook her head. "He'll come here. With men. Guns. He'll burn this place to the ground if he has to," maybe Malachi said, "but I'd rather die doing the right thing than live knowing I failed again." There was no bravado in his voice, no performance, just a bone-deep resolution that came from living with the taste of failure for too many years. He wasn't looking for redemption. He wasn't even looking to be forgiven. He just wasn't willing to make the same mistake twice. "I've got food, water. A rifle that hasn't forgotten how to shoot," he said. "You're safe here for now." Evangeline wanted to believe him, wanted to feel safe, but safety for her had always been a lie wrapped in politeness and promises that rotted from the inside out. "You don't know what he's capable of," she murmured. Malachi's eyes went hard. "I do." She looked at him, saw the scars no one could see, and felt something shift in her chest. This man wasn't her savior. He wasn't her protector. But maybe, just maybe, he was willing to stand with her. And that, after everything, was more than she had dared hope for. The storm hadn't fully passed, but the thunder had grown quieter, retreating like a beast that had already done its worst. Malachi stood by the window, watching shadows move at the edge of his land. Evangeline was behind him, silent, her breath tight in her chest. Then came the knock. Not frantic, not desperate. It was calm, precise, polite. The kind of knock that says, "We know you're inside, and we'll keep smiling until we don't have to." Malachi didn't answer right away. He set down his mug, empty now but still warm, and reached for the rifle that hadn't left his side in over a decade. His fingers curled around the worn wood with quiet familiarity. Evangeline flinched at the sound of boots on the porch, her body pressed into the shadows beside the fireplace. "Stay here," Malachi said, voice low. She nodded, clutching the blanket tighter, heart hammering. From outside, a voice rose through the rain, smooth, elegant, and soaked in arrogance. "Malachi Thorne, sorry to trouble you at this hour. I'm looking for a young woman. You may have seen her. Wedding dress, confused, possibly unwell." Malachi opened the door slowly. The figure that greeted him was exactly as he remembered. Clayton Voss sat tall in the saddle, his expensive coat glistening with rain, hat tilted just enough to show off the scratches that hadn't healed. Behind him were 4 men armed and too quiet. They didn't bother pretending they were here for a conversation. "Evening," Malachi said evenly, stepping just beyond the doorway, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. "You're a hard man to find," Thorne Clayton replied. "But not impossible." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "As I said, I'm looking for my bride. She ran off before we could exchange vows. Must have been nerves." "Or fear," Malachi said flatly. Clayton's eyes narrowed, but his smile stayed. "You wouldn't mind if my men had a look around, would you? Just to be safe." "I would mind," Malachi replied, shifting his stance so the rifle rested clearly against his shoulder. "This is private land. You got a warrant?" One of Clayton's men, a scar-faced brute with cold eyes, swung a leg off his horse and stepped onto the porch like he'd done it 100 times before. "We're not here to play legal games," Clayton said. "We're here to collect what belongs to me." The word "belongs" hit Malachi like a slap. Evangeline wasn't property. She wasn't some misplaced asset on a ledger. She was a person, and she was afraid, and the man in front of him had put that fear in her bones. The scarred man reached the top step. Malachi didn't flinch, but he adjusted his grip. The rifle wasn't pointed yet, but it was no longer resting either. "One more step," Malachi warned, "and you'll be the first to find out how good my aim still is." That changed everything. The air snapped taut, the wind paused, even the rain seemed to hold its breath. The man froze, hand near his holster. Clayton's voice grew quieter, deadlier. "You really want to make this difficult, old man? You really want to find out how far I'll go to stop you?" Malachi countered. No one moved. The tension wasn't just thick, it was alive. Evangeline, still hidden, felt it too. Her entire body shook, not from cold now, but from the realization that Malachi wasn't bluffing. He would fight. For her. And maybe for something deeper he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For a long moment the only sound was the rain hitting the porch roof, and the occasional snort of horses growing restless in the cold. Then Clayton leaned forward in his saddle, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said, "I've heard about you, Thorne. Former sheriff, man of honor, until your wife chose someone better." The insult wasn't casual, it was meant to sting, and it did. But Malachi didn't rise to it. He held steady. "Funny thing about better," he said, "depends on who's still standing when the smoke clears." Clayton's grin faded just slightly. "This isn't over." "It never is," Malachi answered. Then finally, Clayton motioned to his men. The scarred one stepped back. The tension didn't break so much as it shifted like a storm cloud, still circling just out of reach. "Be seeing you," Clayton said, tipping his hat. Malachi didn't respond. He waited until the last hoofbeat faded into the night, then closed the door softly, rifle still tight in his hand. Evangeline emerged from the shadows, eyes wide, lips trembling. "You could have let them search," she whispered. "Let them take me." Malachi turned to her. "I could have." His voice was tired but resolute. "But I didn't." And in that moment she realized what it meant to be chosen. Not owned, not bartered. Chosen. For the first time in her life. The storm outside hadn't eased, but the one inside Evangeline had found its voice. She stood near the fireplace, the wool blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her breath short and shallow. Malachi set the rifle down, slowly, deliberately, his hands steady, even as the tension lingered in the room like smoke. He glanced at her not as a protector seeking gratitude, but as a man who had just taken one step too far into someone else's fight. "Next time," she said, her voice strained, "they won't knock first." Malachi nodded once as if he already knew. "That man doesn't lose," she added, watching him carefully. "He doesn't forget. You should have let him take me." "Like hell," Malachi said flatly. He moved to the fire, stoked it back to life, and didn't say anything more. But Evangeline stepped forward, no longer hiding behind fear or silence. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice rising not in anger but desperation. "He'll be back. With more men. And they won't care that you're a good man. They'll kill you just for opening the door." Malachi turned, meeting her eyes. "Then let them come." Evangeline felt her knees weaken at the calm in his voice. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't recklessness. It was resolve. The kind of steady steel that comes from someone who had lost everything and learned how to stand anyway. "Why?" she asked, genuinely bewildered. "You don't even know me." His reply was soft. "Because I know what happens when you don't act. I know what it costs to stay silent." She blinked, eyes wet, her throat closing up. "I won't let you die because of me." "You're not letting me do anything," he said, his voice suddenly rougher, more human. "I'm choosing this. You can't take that away from me." The fire cracked in the silence that followed, casting golden shadows on the walls, like memories that refused to die. Evangeline stepped closer to the door, staring at the latch, then at the window where Malachi had stood defiant a few minutes earlier. "They'll come back," she said. "Even if you talk them down, even if you lie, Clayton won't stop until he has me back under his thumb." Her fingers touched her wrist unconsciously, tracing the faint bruises he'd left there. "He says I'm his, that I belong to him." Malachi's eyes darkened. "You belong to no one." She turned to face him, and something in her eyes, green sharp, bruised by the world, lit up like fire. "Then let me prove it." "How?" "By not hiding." Her voice was trembling but firm. "Next time he comes, I'll face him." Malachi started to object, but she cut him off. "If you try to protect me from the truth, if you hide me like I'm some secret shame, then he wins. Again. I won't live like that." Her chin lifted, and for the first time he saw not a frightened runaway, but a woman who had stared into the jaws of a monster and decided to scream back. "You want to help me?" she asked. "Then stand beside me, not in front of me." The fire danced between them. He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment he understood something he hadn't in a decade. Strength wasn't always about guns or silence or keeping the world out. Sometimes it looked like a woman in borrowed clothes, daring to challenge the man who nearly owned her. "All right," he said softly. "But when the time comes, if it gets bad, then we fight," she whispered. "Together." And with that, the line was drawn, not between him and her, but between both of them, and the man coming to claim what was never his. It was nearly midnight when the second knock came. Softer this time, hesitant. Not the arrogant tapping of a man who thought he owned the world, but the uncertain rhythm of someone asking permission to exist. Malachi rose from the chair by the fire rifle already in hand. Evangeline moved toward the back instinctively, but he raised a hand. "Wait." They both stood still as the knock came again, followed by a voice. Young, familiar, nervous. "Mr. Thorne, it's Deputy Morrison. I'm alone." Malachi's jaw tightened. He glanced at Evangeline, then crossed to the door. Through the narrow window pane, he saw the outline of a single rider dismounted in the raincoat, soaked through badge faintly glinting in the lantern light. Slowly, cautiously, Malachi cracked the door. "What do you want, Morrison?" "To help the deputy," said his voice low but firm. "If you'll let me." That caught Malachi off guard. He hadn't heard sincerity like that in years, not without a catch. He opened the door a little wider. Morrison looked younger than Malachi remembered, maybe 25 at most. Mud splashed up to his knees, hat, crushed hands trembling slightly from the cold or something deeper. "Speak your piece," Malachi said. Morrison stepped inside, not fully, just enough to be heard over the storm. His eyes found Evangeline instantly standing in the shadows. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat. "What happened at the church? It wasn't right. Not to you, not to your brother." Evangeline stepped forward slowly, her voice breaking. "Tommy, is he—" Morrison nodded solemnly. "Alive, but hurt. Clayton had him beat near to death, then tossed him in a cell for disturbing the peace." Her knees buckled slightly. Malachi caught her elbow without a word. Morrison's jaw clenched. "Sheriff won't release him. Says not until Clayton's done settling what he calls unfinished business." Malachi's expression darkened. "So why are you here? Because I didn't sign up to enforce fear," Morrison said quietly. "And because I know what Clayton did to Sarah Mitchell." The name struck the room like lightning. Malachi froze. Evangeline's breath caught. Morrison kept going. "I was there," he said, voice shaking now. "I helped pull her out of the river. She didn't jump. We all knew it. She had bruises on her neck, wrists, like someone had tried to erase her. But the evidence vanished. Sheriff claimed she slipped. Called it a suicide." He looked at Malachi. "You filed a report. I read it. Before it disappeared." "And you said nothing," Malachi growled. Morrison lowered his head. "I was green. I was scared. And the sheriff made it clear whose side we were on." And now Evangeline asked, "What's changed?" Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out something that gleamed even in the dim light. A silver badge, heavier, older federal. Marshal Williams is coming. He's been building a case against Voss for months. Trafficking, bribery, racketeering, and Sarah Mitchell. He turned to Evangeline. Your testimony could tie it all together. The forced marriage, the threats, the violence. With your voice and the marshal's warrant, we can bring Voss down. She looked at the badge like it was a holy relic, but fear coiled in her chest like smoke. If I speak, he'll kill Tommy. Morrison's jaw tightened. If we wait, he'll kill all of us. This is the best chance we've got. Malachi moved to the window, staring into the night where Clayton had disappeared. How long until the marshal gets here by dawn? Morrison replied. And how long until Voss realizes you're gone? Same. Silence fell. Not the hopeless kind, but the kind that waits for resolve to form. Evangeline stepped closer to the fire, her eyes meeting Malachi's. So what do we do now? Malachi looked down at the rifle beside him, then at the two people who hours ago had been strangers. Now they were threads in a fuse line. Now, he said quietly, we prepare to survive until morning. Dawn came gray and grim, the sky heavy with the weight of unfinished threats. The first light revealed the land soaked from the night's storm, the trees dripping with silence, the wind whispering warnings that only the old and wounded could understand. Malachi was already at the window rifle across his lap eyes on the eastern ridge. Evangeline stood beside him, dressed in the spare clothes he had offered the night before, simple, durable belonging once to the woman who had broken him. Somehow they looked right on her. Not like borrowed memories, but like armor forged anew. She no longer looked like a runaway bride. She looked like someone ready to fight for her life. How many? She asked softly. 12, Malachi answered. At least. From the tree line riders began to emerge more men than before, better armed, more disciplined. Voss was no longer playing games. He'd come not to retrieve a bride, but to make a statement. Burn down resistance, end the story on his terms. Clayton rode at the front, dismounting with a confidence born of too many unchecked victories. This time he wasn't smiling. Thorne, he called out. We need to talk. Malachi stepped onto the porch, Evangeline at his side. She could feel the tremble in her legs, but she didn't let it show. I'm listening, Malachi said. Clayton's voice was calm, cold. You give me the girl. I give you her brother. You keep your life, your ranch, your peace. Refuse, and we torch this place to the ground. Evangeline took a breath, then stepped forward. I'll go, she said clearly. Every man turned to look at her. Malachi spun to protest, but she kept going. I'll go with you, Clayton. But you release my brother, unharmed, and you leave Malachi Thorne alone, forever. Clayton's eyes narrowed. You're not in a position to bargain. Aren't I? She replied. You want me alive. Compliant. You want a prize, not a corpse. But hear me now, if anything happens to either of them, I'll make sure every court, every paper, every official hears my story. About what you did to Sarah Mitchell. About what you did to me. The name hit harder than a bullet. Clayton's face twitched. His men shifted uncomfortably. You should be careful, my dear, he said, his voice razor thin. You're walking dangerous ground. So are you, she said. But I'm done being afraid of you. It was then that the thunder returned, not from the sky, but from behind the ridge. Hoofbeats, not 12 this time, but more. Organized, steady, and different. Marshal Williams had arrived. 6 riders came over the hill, their badges gleaming like small pieces of justice, their expressions grim and unreadable. Clayton's confidence cracked. Clayton Voss, the marshal called. You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell conspiracy to commit murder and trafficking. You have no proof, Clayton snarled. but his hand was already reaching toward his holster. "We have enough," the marshal replied, "and we have witnesses. You're done." Clayton drew. So did his men. So did Malachi. The gunfight that followed was short, violent, and absolute. Clayton got his shot off, but it missed. Deputy Morrison's didn't. The bullet hit Voss clean in the chest, sending him off his feet and into the mud. Around him, the marshals moved with grim precision. 3 of Voss's men went down. The rest threw down their weapons when it was clear they were outgunned and outmatched. In seconds, it was over. Malachi lowered his rifle slowly. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded with something old and unfamiliar. Relief. Evangeline dropped to her knees in the mud beside Clayton's body, not out of grief, but finality. The monster was dead. The nightmare was over. Morrison ran to her, already signaling toward the marshals. "Her brother?" she asked urgently. "Still in the cell," Morrison said. "We'll get him out within the hour. Alive, beaten. But yes." Evangeline stood, mud-streaked across her borrowed clothes, and turned to Malachi. He was watching her, not with triumph, but with something deeper. Gratitude, recognition. They had survived. Together. The storm, the power, the fire, it had all come and gone. And they were still standing. The rain stopped sometime around noon, but the earth still held the weight of it, soaked sunless, like it hadn't decided whether to breathe again. The marshals were finishing the arrests. The surviving members of Clayton Voss's gang had been disarmed and bound. Sheriff Bradley, the man who'd buried justice beneath a pile of bribes, was already on his way to the capital in chains arrested later that day when the truth reached town. The silence on Malachi's land felt different now, no longer hollow but earned. Clayton's body had been removed, but the impact of his presence still lingered like the stench of smoke after a fire. Evangeline stood beside Malachi on the porch, staring out over the horizon. Her brother had been released that morning, bruised, bloodied, but alive. She'd hugged him like a drowning woman finding dry land for the first time in years. "It's over," she said, but the words didn't taste quite right. "Not yet." "It's beginning," Malachi corrected quietly. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. She understood. The days that followed were quiet. Not the haunting quiet Malachi had known for 10 years, but a healing one. Morrison stayed a while to help file statements and coordinate with Marshal Williams. The investigation into Clayton's empire expanded bank records, land grabs, marriage arrangements. More girls were found, more lives saved. As for Malachi, he found himself adjusting to a world that included more than solitude. He built a second chair for the porch, bought sugar again, repaired the bedroom he'd closed off for a decade. Evangeline stayed, not because she had nowhere to go, but because for the first time she had the choice. She fed the horses, planted lavender outside the window, sewed curtains where old bedsheets had hung like apologies. They didn't talk about love, not at first, but it lived in the way she poured his coffee, in the way he turned down the bed just before she entered the room. They shared silence like other couples shared stories deep, necessary, and full of meaning. 6 months later, they stood in the same church where Evangeline had once fled from a future she hadn't chosen. But this time she walked down the aisle on her own terms. No debts, no chains, just a smile that didn't shake and eyes that didn't look back. Malachi stood waiting in a simple coat, hair neatly combed, hands folded, but it was his eyes that made her breath catch. He didn't look like the man who had once given up on hope. He looked like someone who had fought to the edge of hell and found his way home. The dress was new, modest, soft, not white, but a pale blue that matched the Nevada sky. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, Evangeline smiled, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. "Yes," she said, voice steady. "God, yes." And when the preacher asked Malachi the same, his answer came with a voice steadier than stone. with everything I have left. They didn't promise perfection, just presence and protection. A few guests clapped. Morrison wiped at his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Tommy stood in the back, smiling with a bruised lip and a healing heart. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the cabin in gold, Malachi sat beside Evangeline on the porch. They defended together. She reached for his hand and he didn't pull away. For once, he didn't need the silence to feel safe. "Funny," she whispered, leaning into him. What he murmured. "Sometimes the life worth protecting," she said, "is the one you never saw coming." Malachi nodded, his eyes on the horizon, and sometimes he said softly, "The rain brings more than storms." The sky above them was finally clear, and in the place where the rain didn't reach, two souls began again.